Turn with me to the book of Leviticus, chapter 1. We're going to do Leviticus for a change. That's a joke. The law of the burnt offerings, that's what we're going to deal with today. I thought we'd do a little series on the offerings and sacrifices in the Old Testament. I've wanted to do this for quite some time, but have not really had opportunity. There's always other things that felt that the Lord wanted me to share. To get a context on this, there is a connection between the book of Exodus and the book of Leviticus, in that Exodus deals with the redemption from Egypt by the blood of the Lamb, and the focus is upon our justification by faith. Leviticus deals with the work of Christ as it pertains to worship and communion with God. Leviticus presupposes that we have already come out of Egypt. We have already been redeemed and justified. In Leviticus, we're brought into fellowship with God. And this is something a little different. So we're learning what kind of life that God expects from us and what is satisfactory to Him. What is God satisfied with insofar as our Christian life is concerned? Fellowship with God. To that extent, the first letter of John, 1 John, has to do with this as well, because he talks about having fellowship with God, especially in chapter 1 of 1 John. Now, the book of Exodus is a Greek name, and we get that from the Septuagint, but its Hebrew name is, these are the names. The Hebrew name of Leviticus is, and he called. You can see the connection here. These are the names, which is Exodus, because these are the names that he is calling out of Egypt. He's naming us by name. He knows his sheep. But in Leviticus, it is, and he called. So it's already past tense. These are the ones that he has already called out. Now what? Now what do you do? So to some extent, Leviticus is a book that needs to be understood because it deals with the Christian life and our fellowship with God specifically. Now, the book of Numbers is also dealing with our Christian life, but the book of Numbers, the Hebrew title is In the Wilderness. It deals with our Christian life or our Christian walk, more of our Christian walk in the wilderness as we travel through the wilderness, as opposed to Leviticus, which deals with our fellowship with God. The offerings and sacrifices instruct us, and in comparing Jesus' life as recorded in the New Testament, we learn by living example what God intends for us to become. In other words, the book of Leviticus tells us how to have fellowship with God, but then when we get to the New Testament, particularly in the life of Christ, we see this actually enacted out. We see this manifested by illustration. So he is the example, the living example for us to follow. So this book is not merely prophetic of Christ, which is usually how it is portrayed, and that's correct. It is prophetic of Christ, but it's not only prophetic of Christ. It's also instructive and prophetic of what we are becoming. It's instructive as to what we are to be and prophetic of what we are becoming. Now, it's been said that Christ is the sum of the offerings. That is, he is not some of the offerings, S-O-M-E, he is the sum, S-U-M. That is, he is the complete or the completeness of the offerings. And what that simply means is Christ is found in every one of these offerings. He is the sacrifice, he is the priest, and he is also the one who is offering the sacrifice, because he offered himself. So Christ is found in every page here in Leviticus, in all these offerings, but let's not lose sight of the fact that we are to grow up to be the same as Christ. It is not just talking about somebody else, it is also talking about you. But meanwhile, of course, we see various portions of the offering manifested in our lives, and even that is imperfect until such time as we are fully mature. Christ is the sum of the offerings. We are, in essence, just a portion of them. We manifest portions of them here and now. Throughout our life, we are expected to grow up until we too become the sum of the offerings, even as Christ was. Now, in each of the three offerings, there are three main objects. We mentioned these earlier. There is the offerer, the priest, who is the mediator, and there is the offering. Let's look at John chapter 10, verses 15 through 18. In John 10, and keep your finger back in Leviticus 1, because we will be shifting around quite a bit from the Old Testament to the New. In John 10, we find that Jesus is the offerer. That is, he is the one who is giving the offering. In verse 15 it says, "As the Father knoweth me, even so know I the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. And other sheep I have which are not of this fold, them also I must bring, and they shall hear my voice, and there shall be one fold and one shepherd. Therefore doth my Father love me, because I lay down my life, that I might take it again. No man taketh it from me, but I lay it down of myself. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it again. This commandment have I received of my Father." So Jesus makes it very clear that the authorities, both Jewish and Roman, could not kill him. He was laying down his life, and they were only the instruments of the Father's will. He was then the offerer. We find also that he is the priest or the mediator in Hebrews chapter 9, verses 11 and 12. In Hebrews 9, verses 11 and 12, we read, "But Christ, being come a high priest of good things to come, by a greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is to say, not of this building, neither by the blood of bulls or of goats and calves, but by his own blood, he entered in once into the holy place, having obtained eternal redemption for us." He himself is the priest. He is the high priest, but he enters in with his own blood. He's not entering in with a lesser sacrifice, of which that was only a type and a shadow. So he is the mediator of the new covenant. And, of course, by his own blood, that means also that he is the offering. And we know from John 1:29, John said, "Behold the Lamb of God, which taketh away the sin of the world." He is that lamb. He is that sacrifice. But in Hebrews 9, verse 26, we read, "For then must he often have suffered since the foundation of the world, but now, once in the end of the world, hath he appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself." So he came as a sacrifice of himself. These are the three main objects in every offering. There are also various types of burnt offerings. There's various types of offerings. There's the burnt offering, the sin offering, the trespass offering, the meal offering. But when you're dealing with the burnt offerings themselves, there are three main types of this as well. If you go back to Leviticus chapter 1, verses 3 through 5, "If his offering be a burnt sacrifice of the herd, let him offer a male without blemish. He shall offer it of his own voluntary will," and that really should read, "He shall offer it for his acceptance." That's kind of a mistranslation. "For his acceptance, at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation before the Lord. And he shall put his hand upon the head of the burnt offering, and it shall be accepted for him to make atonement for him. And he shall kill the bullock." See, this is where this is the first type. It's of the herd, and therefore it is a bullock. "He shall kill the bullock before the Lord, and the priests, Aaron's sons, shall bring the blood, and sprinkle the blood round about the altar that is by the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. And he shall flay the burnt offering and cut it into pieces." Now, you notice first in this that it is the offerer who, first of all, lays his hands upon the bull in order to identify with it, and then he's the one who kills the bull. And that's like killing himself in type form. This is what Jesus did. Basically, he was offering himself. A burnt offering specifically deals with absolute devotion to God in everything. That is, there is no part of this that is spared. The whole thing is just burned up completely. And we too are called into that kind of service of absolute devotion to God. In the Old Testament, they had this bull which represented the person who was offering. And in representing there, this bull or this ox was a servant. In Psalm 144, verse 14, we see the symbolism of the ox. The ox, of course, was the king of the domestic animals, which served in pulling the plow and things like that, pulling carts. Psalm 144:14 says that our oxen may be strong to labor. Strong to labor. And that is the symbolism of the ox or the bullock. The ox or the bullock was the most useful in that it could pull the heaviest load, or the strongest of these burnt offerings. The strongest of the three. Also, it shows the theme of the book of Mark. You remember the four Gospels have different themes. They all stress a different thing. Matthew stresses, "Behold your king." Mark stresses, "Behold your servant," or "Behold my servant." That's a quote from Isaiah. "Behold my servant." Luke stresses Christ as the Son of Man, and John stresses Christ as the Son of God. And in these, we have the four beasts around the throne. Matthew, "Behold the king," which is the lion of the tribe of Judah. So his genealogy is given carefully. And Mark, you have, "Behold my servant," which is the ox. Luke, "Behold the Son of Man," which is, of course, the man, the face of the man. And John, the eagle, "Behold the Son of God," the one who has the visionary and who rises up high. In these four beasts around the throne, which are all manifestations of Christ as well, the ox or the bullock symbolizes or is brought forth particularly in the book of Mark, which is, "Behold my servant." We're going to skip just a little bit for now in Leviticus 1 and drop down to verse 10. We'll pick up these other details later. There's a second type of burnt offering. Some people could not afford a bullock that was too expensive for them, and so they would bring an offering of the flocks. So it says, "If his offering be of the flocks, namely of the sheep or of the goats, for a burnt sacrifice, he shall bring it a male without blemish. He shall kill it on the side of the altar northward before the Lord, and the priests, Aaron's sons, shall sprinkle his blood round about the altar, and he shall cut it in pieces," and so on. What do the sheep and the goats represent in this, say, in contrast to the bullock? Well, the sheep represents a submissive attitude, because only if you are in full submission to God can you be a burnt offering. It's a requirement of a burnt offering. If you want to be a burnt offering before God, or as we'll see later, a living sacrifice that is acceptable unto God for your acceptance, Romans 12:1 and 2, you need to see that aspect of the sheep. That is, the sheep is submissive, and it's the focal point of Passover. Now, at Passover, in the Feast of Passover, they could kill either a sheep or a goat, but for the most part, Passover represented the sheep, and the Day of Atonement represented the goats. On the Day of Atonement, they had two goats, you remember, and the one was killed and its blood sprinkled on the mercy seat, and the other goat was led out into the wilderness by the hand of a fit man. You have in here Passover and the Day of Atonement whereas the bullocks came into prominence at the Feast of Tabernacles. On the Feast of Tabernacles, they sacrificed 70 bullocks, 13 the first day, 12 the second day, 11 the next day, and so on, down to 7. You'll find that in Numbers chapter 29, if anyone is interested. Okay, back in Leviticus 1, you have a third type of burnt offering, and this is for the real poor in the land, those who can't afford it. It says, if the burnt sacrifice for the offering to the Lord be of fowls, then he shall bring his offering of turtle doves or of young pigeons, and so on. What does a pigeon or a dove symbolize, and how does it teach us of the burnt offerings? Well, in Matthew 10, verse 16, Jesus said, "Be ye therefore wise as serpents and harmless as doves." Harmless as doves. Isaiah 59:11, "We roar all like bears and mourn sore like doves." Mourning like doves. And you'll see this also in Ezekiel 7:16. And Jesus said, "Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted." And that word comfort, by the way, is derived from the same word as the Comforter, which is talked about later. The Paraclete, the Parakleo, shall be comforted. And so it's a play on words, meaning be filled with the Spirit as well. See, the Comforter comforts, right? And what does the Comforter do? He fills you with His Spirit. So those who mourn will be filled with His Spirit as well. So the dove has these two aspects of it. There's the mourning aspect and there is the harmless aspect. Now, when we compare these three, how do these compare? How do we see this? Well, these are three types or grades of burnt offerings. Everybody is in a different place. There are some who in their spiritual life cannot afford more than a dove. What does that mean? Well, it means that they are like a dove. You remember, because they are identified with the burnt offering. All they can do is pray and mourn for the iniquities that's being done out here and also within us. But they are called to be harmless as doves. In other words, don't be in everybody's face. Don't always be confronting everybody. A confrontational type of person is not harmless as a dove. Now, I know them's fighting words. There's some people who love to be confrontational. We have ministries out there that are nothing but expose ministries, or ministries of criticism. And it's all they do. And they think that's discernment. They don't realize the spirit of discernment is not the same thing as the spirit of criticism. A dove is the weakest of these burnt offerings, and yet it is just as acceptable as the sheep, the goat, and the bullock. So in its qualitative usefulness, it is just as acceptable. All of these are acceptable. But in their usefulness, insofar as they're being a servant, the dove is the least useful in the sense of calling. Okay, and I have a feeling these represent different callings from different people. You have the new Christians who should really be taught to be as harmless as doves, but you don't put them in a position of pulling the plow for the whole church. You know what I mean? The sheep is the next in line, the next line up. A sheep has some strength, but they are also very submissive, and in that sense a lot like the dove. You know, a dove's character, and that's why when Jesus came, he was a sheep led before the slaughterers, and even as a sheep before shearers is dumb, and so on. He's led like a lamb to the slaughter. Basically, he's harmless, and he allows himself to be killed. Now, the goats are the next level up in strength. In fact, the Hebrew word for goat is spelled Az, Oz, and Oz means strength. It comes from actually from the root word azaz, which means strength. The goat itself is named for the word strength. That's interesting. The difference between a sheep and a goat is strength. Now, strength is not the same as being confrontational. If we learn to be a dove first and a sheep next, then when we come into the goat stage, we will already have the character necessary to be an acceptable burnt offering, even as a goat. That make sense? The problem is not strength. The problem is that we are not harmless, that we are not submissive to God. And being a burnt offering is something where you learn to die. You learn to be burned up completely. Nothing of you is left, and it all goes to God. Complete devotion to God, because this is being offered to God, and it is not being offered to man. Nobody eats of this burnt offering. It's completely burned up. God is the one who eats of it. This is called the food of God. And finally, you come to the highest level of strength, which is the bullock or the ox. Whatever one's calling is, whatever one's level of strength is, deals with the usefulness in ministering to others. Now let's look at Mark chapter 10, verses 43 and 44. And Mark would know, since he's talking about this theme of being a servant. Mark 10, 43 and 44. I guess we better start with 42. Jesus called to him and saith unto them, You know that they which are accounted to rule over the nations exercise lordship over them, and their great ones exercise authority upon them. But so shall it not be among you. But whosoever will be great among you shall be your minister or servant, and whosoever of you will be the chiefest shall be servant of all. So to be a servant is one thing, to be servant of all is another. We find that in Jesus' definitions of rulership, the way to be a ruler is to be a servant. Unfortunately, what we often see is, especially among relatively immature Christians, they can't wait to rule and reign with Christ, and they're just going to lay down the law and, the axe will fall. And they don't realize that if you really want to be a ruler, you have to redefine the term. A ruler is a servant. And if you want to be a ruler of all, then you'd better be servant of all. Well, Jesus was that. Nobody was a greater servant than Jesus Christ. But the rest of us, if we want to rule, then we'd better not focus on learning how to rule, but how to be a servant. Don't focus on learning how to throw your weight around and be a great leader, to tell this person to do that and tell that person to do this. That's not the point. The point is, what can I do to help you? How can I be a minister? How can I minister to your needs? That is what this is all about. It should be mentioned also that all of these animals are clean animals and acceptable burnt sacrifices. They're all clean. There is no unclean animal here. They didn't sacrifice any pigs or didn't sacrifice any lizards or alligators. It was all clean animals, and they were all acceptable unto God. But some are more useful in their callings, and as such have more value insofar as their ability to minister to others is concerned. This is not a matter of physical strength. That is how it is manifested in these animals, as physical strength. But with us, our strength or ability to minister is really based upon our spiritual strength. There are some who need to be ministered to, and then there's others who need to minister. Those who are in need of being ministered to should have as their goal a ministry, being able to minister to others instead. Otherwise, it becomes a perpetual motion. If people are stuck in the need to be ministered to all the time, you need to understand that sooner or later, they should gain strength to the place where they can minister to others. In respect to their ability or acceptability before God, they all have equal value. So if you feel like you cannot do much for the kingdom of God, if you're just a dove, then just do your part and mourn. In other words, pray for people. Pray for people to turn to God. You see, to mourn is also to fast. The Day of Atonement is the day of mourning, but this was a day of fasting. To mourn was also a euphemism for fasting, and it became a euphemism then for praying for other people. So a dove, if you can't do anything else, you can still pray. I mean, people can do that from a wheelchair, right? You can pray for anybody. And there is usefulness in that, and that is an acceptable offering unto God as well. In Ezekiel 7:16, we read a little bit about this. The context here with verse 15, the sword is without, and the pestilence and famine within, and he that is in the field shall die with the sword, and he that is in the city, famine and pestilence shall devour him. But they that escape of them shall escape, and shall be on the mountains like doves of the valleys, all of them mourning, every one for his iniquity. When judgment hits, what God is looking for are people in the mountains, and because it's a time of judgment, there's a lot of doves out there, but they should be mourning for their iniquity, not just bemoaning their fate, okay? But mourning for their iniquity. All hands shall be feeble, and all knees shall be weak as water. Well, the dove is pretty harmless and weak as well, but they can do something. They can mourn for their iniquity. I want to look up one more, and that's James chapter 4, verse 9. I suppose we better start with verse 7. Submit yourselves therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw nigh to God, and he will draw nigh to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Be afflicted, and mourn, and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning, and your joy to heaviness. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he shall lift you up. Speak not evil one of another, brethren. He that speaketh evil of his brother, and judgeth his brother, speaketh evil of the law, and judgeth the law. But if thou judge the law, thou art not a doer of the law, but a judge. There is one lawgiver, who is able to save and to destroy. Who art thou that judgest another? If we are in this condition of mourning, then it is also a humbling ourselves in the sight of the Lord, and not speaking evil of our brother. In other words, be harmless as doves. You see the dove character coming out here? I know it also pictures the lamb character. Nonetheless, it's primarily the dove. Okay, getting back to Leviticus 1 again. There are these three types of offerings. We should explain one thing. There are two basic types of offerings in general. There is the bloodless, and then there's the bloody offerings. They term them in different ways. But the burnt offering and the sin offering and the trespass offering, these offer a life. Okay? There is an animal that is killed. A life is offered to God. The meat offering, which really is better translated a food offering or a meal offering, and a peace offering, these offerings are bloodless. Cain and Abel offered two offerings. Abel offered a blood offering of a lamb, of the flocks. Cain offered the fruits of the ground, the meal offering. Now, both were good offerings. The problem was that one deals with your works, your labor, the other with life itself. Okay, the fruits of the ground represent your labor. We cannot offer to God anything of our labor until the blood has covered us. All of our labor is in vain if it's just our labor, unless the blood covers us first. This is what made Cain's offering unacceptable to God. Another way of categorizing these offerings. The burnt offering, the meat offering, and the peace offering are offerings where the offerer comes for acceptance as a worshiper. He comes for acceptance as a worshiper. And that's why it says right there in verse 3 of Leviticus 1, he shall offer it for his acceptance. For his acceptance. That's why it's important to translate that correctly. And in verse 4, it shall be accepted for him, to make atonement for him. It's the acceptance before God that is important with the offering of a life. You have to find acceptance first before you can give him a present of your labor. Acceptance comes first. The sin offerings and the trespass offerings, the offerer comes as a sinner to pay the penalty for sin and trespasses. He's not coming for acceptance per se, but to pay a penalty for sin and trespass. So there are different ways of categorizing these offerings and so on. And hopefully by the time we get through with this series, you'll have a little better understanding of how these things work. But we're focusing on the burnt offerings today. In the burnt offering, God finds food by which his hunger is satisfied. He finds food by which his hunger is satisfied. Now, what does God hunger for? Does God get hungry? Yeah, he gets hungry. He's only had one meal in all history, only one proper meal. That's Jesus Christ. He's looking for more meals, okay? He's looking for a feast. And the question is, are we going to be a part of that feast or not? He hungers and thirsts after righteousness in the earth, just like what he told us to do. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. They shall be filled. Well, hey, God thirsts and hungers after righteousness too. And he will be filled. That's his intention. That's the whole purpose of this creation. In Leviticus chapter 21, this concept is mentioned. In verse 6, talking about the priests, they shall be holy unto their God, and not profane the name of their God, for the offerings of the Lord made by fire, and the bread of their God they do offer. Therefore they shall be holy. Now the word bread, of course, is the general word for food. It's not just, it doesn't have to just be grain. It's kind of an old English word that had a broader meaning in the 1600s than it does today. But it's really the food of their God, the food of their God. Verse 8, Thou shalt sanctify him therefore, for he offereth the bread of thy God. He shall be holy unto thee. You'll see the same also in verses 17, 21, and 22. It talks about the bread of his God. So it's mentioned here 5 times in Leviticus 21 that the priest was to offer the food of God. So the sacrifices were the food of God, particularly this burnt offering where God got the whole thing. Okay, this is where he really got a feast. The others were, they were kind of partial here. You know, the priest ate it, and sometimes the offerer ate it as well, and only a portion went to God. But in the burnt offering, it all went to God. And this also speaks of our relationship with him. How much of our life have we really devoted to God? Is it the whole thing, or is it partial? Well, we go through these stages. Nobody just suddenly becomes a Christian and suddenly his whole life is devoted to God. I've never seen that happen. Didn't happen in my life either. And I'm still working on it. I should say God is still working on me. And he's worked me over a little bit the past few months here, which is kind of why I'm looking at this burnt offering stuff, because I'm trying to understand what he's doing to me, okay? So this is kind of personal too. God has his ways of testing our hearts to see if we really are fully devoted to him, where he gets everything in our entire life, and we have a full faith in him that he knows what he's doing. Or if we keep back a part of it and say, no, surely you can't mean this. Now in Malachi 1:12, we find that the altar is the table of the Lord. Malachi 1:12. It says, it's kind of a rebuke to the people, but you have profaned it in that you say, the table of the Lord is polluted, and the fruit thereof, even his meat, is contemptible. So Malachi talks about the altar of sacrifice here as the table of the Lord. And they offer the bread of God on this table. So God is finding food that is satisfactory to him. So what is the fire? Well, the fire is kind of the digesting agent in this table, right? The fire is when God is eating the food in the symbolism. Can you see that? Remember when Jonah was in the belly of the fish, he thought he was in hell, right? Out of the belly of hell I cried. Yeah, well, it's a fire. It's about 104 degrees, so they tell us. Science, biology. So poor old Jonah, he was getting digested and he thought he was in hell. Well, you see, it's the fire which signifies the acceptability or God's acceptance of a sacrifice. He accepts it by fire. God is a consuming fire. He is in the business of consuming us as much as we'll, walk into the fire. The problem is we usually run from the fire because we think that's of the devil. Hell is the devil, but God is saying, I'm this fire. So the fire digests the food, showing it to be accepted by the body and assimilated. God is assimilating us. So when the fire comes, the smoke rises, and basically it's taking this food, this flesh, and it is vaporizing it, or it's turning it into smoke. Can you see that? And as it rises then, that is said to be God eating this food. And it burns down to nothing. So the smoke is like vaporized food, which God smells as a sweet incense, or a sweet savor. God is looking for sweetness. Did you know that God likes sweet taste? He doesn't like that bitter stuff. God likes sweet food. He likes sweets. Did you know that? Why do you suppose we like sweet food? Why do you suppose kids will eat nothing but candy if you give them opportunity? Because we're created in His image, that's why. If we have bitterness, if we manifest a heart of bitterness, God doesn't like bitter food. He really doesn't like bitter food. He likes the sweet food. And that is being harmless as a dove, submissive as a sheep or a lamb, but yet gaining in strength like the goat, and finally to the bullock, where you can put your shoulder to the plow and really do something for the kingdom of God. This is the food of God, and this is what God really gets satisfied over, when He can feed upon you, and when He can feed upon the burnt offerings as you become a burnt offering unto God. This is what really satisfies His hunger. This is what He's looking for, and He won't be satisfied until He gets it. And that's the great feast. Of course, one more thing dealing with the sweet savor, or the smoke that rises. God smells or discerns the spirit of this animal. That is what it's really about, its character, its motives, or its spiritual essence. God is not so much concerned with that flesh. What God is eating, He really consumes it through His nostrils, if you will. It's another way of putting it. He is smelling this as a sweet savor. He's really enjoying this. This is what really satisfies Him. Like we smell the dinner before it comes. This is really, this is great. This is almost as good as eating it. And with God, it is the same as eating it. Because, of course, God is a spirit, and He doesn't need food the way we do. But all this is symbolic. It's a sweet savor. God is looking for a sweet feast of perfect spotlessness and absolute devotion. This is food that tastes good to God and which satisfies Him. Now, back in Leviticus 1:3, let's pick up a few details here. We mentioned earlier that in the King James it says, He shall offer it of His own voluntary will, but it's actually, in the margin you'll see that He offers it for His acceptance. In Romans 12, verse 1, Paul says, I beseech you, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable or well-pleasing and perfect or fully mature will of God. living sacrifice. Present your body as a living sacrifice. Now, I hadn't seen this before, but this actually, I think, refers to a sacrifice of a life. It's life that is being sacrificed here. And that is what the burnt offering is, along with some of the others as well. But when you sacrifice a life, life is the thing that God gave from the beginning, which makes all of our works and the fruits of our labors possible. Life is therefore what we owe God, because that's what we got from Him at the beginning. That's what made us alive. That's what made us who we are. That's what made us people. It is when God breathed into His nostrils a breath of life that we became a living soul. For that reason, we are to present to God what He has only given to us. Life. Your whole life. It's not so much your works, it's your life. That's what this burnt offering is all about. Your works are important too. God does care about your labor for Him and the fruits of your labors. But primarily, the first thing, or the highest calling, is to give Him your life. If you give Him your life, then everything else will follow as well. And this is your acceptable service. This is acceptable unto God. The burnt offering was for your acceptance, and God will accept it as a sweet savor. So no doubt Paul had the burnt offering in mind primarily, because it offered a life rather than the fruits of the earth. He wants our being, not merely our doing. If we truly give our life to God, it's because we have learned to die. And that's what the burnt sacrifice signifies. Keep your finger in Romans 12 there, because we're going to go back to it in a bit. Back in Leviticus 1, verses 8 and 9. This is the part, one of the parts that we skipped. And the priest, Aaron's sons, shall lay the parts, the head and the fat, in order upon the wood that is on the fire which is upon the altar. But his inwards and his legs shall he wash in water, and the priest shall burn all on the altar to be a burnt sacrifice, an offering made by fire of a sweet savor unto the Lord. Well, there's a mouthful. There are 4 things mentioned here which go on the altar. The first is the head. What do you suppose the head represents? Mind? The thoughts? 2 Corinthians 10:5 says, bringing every thought into captivity. But more than that, back in Romans 12:2, by the renewing of your mind. This is how Paul interprets this burnt offering. If you are going to be a proper burnt offering, it involves the renewing of your mind. To renew your mind really means you lose your old mind. Sorry. You can't hang on to your old mind, the old way of thinking. There's a renewing of the mind. We have to put on the mind of Christ. The head has to go. The head's got to be put on the altar and burned up. And every thought that goes with it. Now, I do know of one person who actually did this. But, of course, he died and was raised from the dead about 2,000 years ago. The rest of us, we're still working on it. The second thing that is put on the altar is the fat. What does fat represent? Anybody know? I've heard a number of different ideas on this. Deuteronomy 31:20. Deuteronomy 31:20. It says, Moses is saying here, for when I shall have brought them into the land which I swore unto their fathers, that flows with milk and honey, and they shall have eaten and filled themselves and waxen fat, or gotten fat, then will they turn unto other gods and serve them and provoke me and break my covenant. Now what does he mean? What do you mean you got fat? Does that mean everybody got overweight? You ate too much and you got overweight? What does it signify? Look at chapter 32, Deuteronomy 32, verse 15. It uses the term Jeshurun, which is a poetic name for Israel. But Jeshurun waxed fat and kicked. Thou art waxen fat, thou art grown thick, thou art covered with fatness. Then he forsook God which made him, and lightly esteemed the rock of his salvation. They provoked him to jealousy with strange gods, and so on. So again, we find that fatness can be a problem. Then why did God give it to him? See? Does it not represent prosperity? It represents prosperity. Prosperity isn't bad, but it can have a bad effect upon people. There's nothing wrong with prosperity. God doesn't give bad gifts, by making us prosper. Nothing wrong with prosperity. The problem is that prosperity will often turn our hearts, and next thing we know, we are doing what Israel did when God made them prosperous. Psalm 17:10. Psalm 17:10. Talking about God's enemies, it says, "They are enclosed in their own fat. With their mouth they speak proudly." Well, Israel kind of messed up too, but if Israel did, how much more those who didn't know God at all? Psalm 36:8. "They shall be abundantly satisfied with the fatness of thy house, and thou shalt make them drink of the river of thy pleasures. For with thee is the fountain of life, in thy light shall we see light." Now here's a good context. To be abundantly satisfied with the fatness of God's house. There is a prosperity of God's house in being filled with God's things. But what is that? Isaiah 55, I think, tells us the answer. Isaiah 55, the first few verses. "Ho, every one that thirsteth, come ye to the waters, and he that hath no money, come ye and buy and eat. Yea, come, buy wine and milk without money and without price. Wherefore do you spend money for that which is not bread, and your labor for that which satisfies not? Hearken diligently unto me, and eat ye that which is good, and let your soul delight itself in fatness." So if your soul should delight in fatness, then fatness isn't bad. But it depends on what food you eat. It depends on where the fat is located. "Incline your ear and come unto me, hear, and your soul shall live, and I will make an everlasting covenant with you, even the sure mercies of David." So he's not telling you to eat so much as he's telling you to hear. What is that? You feed on the Word, the true bread. Christ himself is the living Word, but more than that, the whole Word. Every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God is how we live. Our problem comes that when we prosper too much in the physical, we tend to forget God and lay off the eating of the Word. That's the tendency, because that's just human nature. And so most of God's people are poor. As Mark Twain used to say, God must love poor people, he made so many of them. Poverty is not necessarily a virtue, but it is sometimes necessary for us to really keep our focus on God and to be dependent on him. If we have everything and are no longer dependent on him, we generally start to forget him, especially in the next generation. This is the way it goes, unfortunately. Jeremiah 31:14, the last one, we'll look at this. Jeremiah 31:14, "And I will satiate the soul of the priests with fatness, and my people shall be satisfied with my goodness, saith the Lord." And again, it's talking about eating the good things of God. You see, we need to eat good things as well, the things of God. God himself doesn't eat bad things. He won't eat a bitter sacrifice. He won't eat the unclean food. If we're to be a living sacrifice, then we need to be a clean food that is acceptable unto God. Of course, we have a tape on how to eat clean spiritual food, and that's the lesson found in Leviticus chapter 11. How to eat clean spiritual food. Well, that applies as well here, because God is looking for clean food. He's not going to accept a burnt offering of unclean food. Are you a clean food or not? That's the question. You are what you eat. If you will eat the things of God and get fully satisfied with the Word of God and hear his voice and follow him, even as Jesus did, then you are a clean spiritual food for God to consume. See, we feed off of him. He feeds off of us. Isn't that amazing? We eat each other. Bunch of cannibals. Huh? But Jesus said, you have to eat my flesh and drink my blood. But he wasn't talking physically. That would have been unlawful. But he is talking about a very deep principle here. And this is brought out in the fat in Leviticus 1, verse 8. Now, in verse 9, there's two other things in Leviticus 1 that are put upon the altar, and that is the inwards and the legs. The inwards, or the innards, deals with the feelings or affections of the heart. The feelings or affections of the heart. The legs deal with, obviously, our daily walk, or the way of life, or how we conduct ourselves. So our feelings and our walk must be washed in water. You see that? His inwards and his legs shall he wash in water. How do we do that? Well, Ephesians 5:26 tells us how. But Paul is talking about the church, and he says in Ephesians 5, verse 26, that he might sanctify and cleanse it with the washing of water by the word. The washing of water by the word. So it's another way of saying that it is the word. As you feed upon the word, this is also a washing of the water, which washes or cleanses the way we feel, our feelings, the affections of our heart. The things that we think are important, or the things that we love, needs to be washed with water, because just because we think it's good, just because we love it, doesn't make it right. Feelings are good, but only after they've been washed with water. We have a problem with this in the church today, because the washing of the word has not really been taking place too much. Okay? When we over-focus on such things as praise and worship, and we don't have that washing of the word, then we get to the place where it kind of becomes an emotional thing, a feelings thing. And all these feelings, it's not that they're bad, it's that they need to be washed with the word. This is what makes them clean and acceptable before God. What is that word? What is that washing? John 7:38 and 39 talks about the Spirit and the Word. This is the Feast of Tabernacles statement that Jesus said on the 8th of Tabernacles. He that believeth on me, as Scripture has said, out of his belly shall flow rivers of living water, but this spake he of the Spirit. So the living water is the Spirit. The water is the Word in Ephesians 5, but the water is the Spirit here. Now, are these different things? The Spirit and the Word have to always be in agreement. There are many people who run into trouble with this because they get a word by the Spirit. It doesn't align with the word that has already been given by the Spirit to others that's written here in this Bible. And so they think that they end up starting a new religion, basically. They think they have a special revelation that now allows them to do what God has forbidden in the Scriptures, or that follows a new track, and it is contradictory to the word that is already written. Well, the Spirit of God is the same Spirit now as it was back then. The Spirit of God is not going to give us a new revelation that contradicts the revelation of the Bible. If that were the case, we would see contradictions in the Bible. From one prophet to another, you would see contradictions. But there are no contradictions. There are seeming contradictions, but there are no actual contradictions, if we truly understand it. John 17:17 says, Thy word is truth. Truth. So if thy word is truth, and 1 John 5:6 says, the Spirit is truth. If the word is truth and the Spirit is truth, then it's all truth. Right? And Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Truth, the living truth, is Jesus himself. He is the manifestation of it. Anything else is just facts. Facts are facts. Truth is truth. But a fact is not necessarily truth. Truth is alive. Truth is a person. You can deal with facts, but if you do not speak the truth in love, It is not truth. You can speak facts, but it's not truth. Truth involves life in it. In other words, it brings life, and it is a revelatory experience by the Spirit of God. There are many people who deal in what they call truth. As it comes out, it is really just a spirit of criticism. And it is really not by the Spirit of God. What they're trying to do is wake people up to the truth. That's not really the case. They're trying to wake people up to facts, of historical facts that might have happened or that are happening. But that is not truth. Facts without the Spirit of God are not truth. Truth are facts with the Spirit of God. You see? We need to see that the distinction here. And of course, when 1 John 5:6 says, the Spirit is truth, it doesn't mean that there is no Holy Spirit and that it's only truth. It depends on what the meaning of is. If I can make a quote from a recent highly presidential source. Spirit is truth. Well, what do you mean by is? Do you mean it equals so that there is no Spirit at all? It's just if you speak truth, then that's the Spirit? Well, no. We also find that God is love, but love is not God. Okay? God is light. But when you turn on the light, that's not God. Okay? It is a quality that is being talked about. That's what the word is means. It's kind of interesting. Years ago, when I was in philosophy class at the University of Minnesota, we spent an entire semester, is about a 3-credit course, on the word is. I never thought I would find that class useful in my later life. But since Mr. Clinton has popularized the word, I find it very useful now. But actually, after that class, I said, forget this philosophy. It's a bunch of garbage. Well, I guess I spoke too soon. God has a place for everything. The Spirit is truth. God is love. God is light. But it is expressing a quality. The bottom line is that this burnt offering is what we are called to become. And in doing so, we become that offering as well. Now there's the word is. You is that offering. You are the offerer. It's a do-it-yourself thing. God is looking for the renewal of your mind so that you will offer yourself as a living sacrifice. And that is the renewing of the mind. And it must be washed, the inwards must be washed with water. And that water is the Spirit, and that water is truth. And that water is Christ. So whether you are a dove, or a sheep, or a goat, or a bullock, a bull in a china shop. Now don't be a bull in a china shop. That's what the spirit of criticism does. You need to be a submissive bull that doesn't wreck everything in the shop. Okay? Food for God. You need to be food for God. Amen.